Hey, how you doing? It is I, the Terrorific Lady, otherwise known as Brandy, and welcome to Retro Horror School, and happy Friday to you. Did June just seem to fly by for you? Because it definitely did for me. It's like I blink and here it's July. Then I'm going to blink and it's going to be December, and then it's going to be the next year. But geez, time's flying by fast for me, but you know, time flies when you're having fun. But enough of that. On to today's video. Today's video is the last in the Horror Subgenre 101 series. If you want to check out the rest of the videos, there is I can never point in the right direction, but there's the link up above. But today we're going to end this series with a bang or a growl, because we are going to be talking about the monster and creature subgenre of horror. We're going to be talking about the history behind the monster creature subgenre. We're going to be talking about the characteristics of the subgenre, and we're going to talk about the subgenres that are nestled inside of the monster creature subgenre. A little horror nesting doll, so to speak. Some people, when they think of horror, they think of the slasher movie, which is perfectly fair, but also something that is synonymous with horror is monsters and creatures. And over the decades, this subgenre has evolved, blending folklore, sci-fi, and just a little bit of pure imagination. Come with me, and it'll be in a world of pure imagination. So people say that Willy Wonka is just soft for kids. Think about that. So yes, there was monster creature literature before the advent of film. But if we are talking about film, one of the earliest examples, I'm going like way before the 1970s here for this one. One of the earliest examples of monster creature horror is the film Nosferatu and Frankenstein. These movies came out in 1922 and 1931, respectively. These movies set the foundation for creature and monster horror and introduced audiences to the idea of an iconic monster or creature. We'll skip a little bit over the 40s and then to the 50s. In the 50s, you had such movies as The Creature from the Black Lagoon and Godzilla. Here you saw a little bit of sci-fi being blended with the monster and creature feature type movies. These kinds of movies, the blending of sci-fi with creatures, they capitalize on post-World War II anxieties and fear of the unknown. Then you had the late 60s going into the 70s, where you saw monsters and creatures being modernized and redefined. For instance, George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, which came out in 1968, totally reinvented the idea of zombies and totally reinvented the genre. And then you had Dracula, another Dracula, which came out in 1979, where he was very suave, a very suave kind of, almost like a 70s feel kind of Dracula. But you saw movies like this modernizing and redefining monsters and creatures and bringing them into the 60s and 70s. Then we have the glorious 80s, which is basically the golden age for practical effects and creature design. Take, for instance, An American Werewolf in London, which came out in 1981. It showcased groundbreaking practical transformation effects. The Fly is a monster or creature movie, also blended with sci-fi, and explores the idea of what happens when science goes wrong. What turns a man into a monster? And then you have movies like Gremlins 1984, which kind of cutified monsters, as I like to call it, but blended it with dark humor, showing that creatures, even though they can be like nasty and gross, you can also inject humor like into the movie as well. The 90s continued to push the boundaries with cutting edge computer effects, such as in the 1993 movie Jurassic Park. Yes, I call Jurassic Park a horror film, but these were groundbreaking computer effects that nobody had ever seen before. They basically brought dinosaurs, monsters, to life. In the 90s, you had vampire movies such as Interview with the Vampire that offered a different kind of take on the vampire. Rather than the grotesque vampire, you have vampires that are gothic and romantic. In the 2000s, you had found footage horror making a surge, and that offered a new way to showcase monster creature movies. In the movie Cloverfield, this is a very good example of this. It showcased monsters destroying a town, and you saw it all through the lens of a camera. Just a little brief aside, I talked about Cloverfield in my video about 5 horror movies that don't cause motion sickness. Did you suffer the Cloverfield effect, like motion sickness? I most certainly did. But I talked a little bit about Cloverfield and the Cloverfield effect and what that was about in that video. Yeah, Cloverfield uses a found footage format to showcase the creature. And then you had new types of monsters, like indiscriminate monsters, making their way to the screens in the early 2000s, such as in the 2005 horror movie The Descent. Subterranean underground creatures. Then in the 2010s, you had meta horror kind of creeping in, such as in the movie The Cabin in the Woods, which poked at horror tropes and kind of flipped them on its ear and reinvented them. And then you had innovation in the monster and creature genre, such as in A Quiet Place, which came out in 2018, introducing the idea of sound attracting creatures. And you had to be just super quiet or they'd eat you. Now let's talk a little bit about the characteristics of a monster or a creature film. A monster creature film doesn't necessarily have to have all of these characteristics to be called a monster creature film, but these are the ones that are the most common. First off, the monster creature usually has mysterious origins, usually from a curse or a science experiment gone wrong. An American Werewolf in London and The Fly are 2 good examples of this type of monster or creature movie. Then there's always this element of suspense in a monster creature movie. You're kind of wondering, well, okay, are they lurking in the shadows? Are they ready to attack? But in monster or creature movies, this is very, very prominent. They're always like in the rafters waiting to The Mist is a very good example of creatures kind of lurking in the fog or the shadows waiting to strike. Usually in a monster or creature film, it looks very grotesque, very gross. It is brought to life with these very practical, grotesque effects. And The Fly, I'm going to mention it again, The Fly is a super good example of the use of such effects. And then in a monster creature movie, a staple of it is that you always have an expert who is looking to understand and or find ways to stop the monster or the creature. Think of Van Helsing and Dracula. Think of Dr. Grant in Jurassic Park when he's giving his advice on how to avoid the T-Rex, along those lines. And last but not least, one of the final characteristics is that the monster or creature, all its entire existence usually just revolves around violence and kills. It really has no other purpose or reason for existence other than that. Think of things like Cloverfield, where the monster just like wreaks havoc on the entire town. Now, all the other subgenres had different flavors or different types. So does the monster creature subgenre. Let's break down the subgenres within the subgenres. First up, you have zombie movies, and these movies frequently feature the undead that has come back to life and that attack the living. Night of the Living Dead is the beginning of zombies that are like that, and that is the gold standard. It set the standard for all zombie movies going forward. Then next up, you have vampires. These monsters and creatures have been a staple of the horror genre for centuries. And what do we think of when we think of vampires? The ultimate bloodsucker, Dracula. Sci-fi and aliens, they blend together because aliens usually go with sci-fi. And these kinds of monster creature movies bring the fear of aliens and extraterrestrial life to our doorsteps. Think of Ridley Scott's Alien, which came out in 1979. The monster lurking in the shadows, ready to strike. Animals in nature tends to showcase horror from the natural world. Think of movies like Jaws, where you got the shark that makes people afraid to go into the water because it is a mindless killing machine. The neo-monster subgenre shows modern takes on classic or iconic horror movies or horror icons. The Cabin in the Woods is a very good example of this. If we think of the homage to Pinhead, that guy that had all the buzz saws in his head, as a perfect example of the neo-monster subgenre. Next, you have the classic and the mythological subgenre, which, as it sounds, it brings classical and mythological monsters to life. You may or may not consider this a horror movie. A lot of horrific stuff happens, but Clash of the Titans is a good example of Clash of the Titans is a good example of mythological monsters and creatures brought to life. Finally, werewolves basically translate to man-wolf, and like vampires, they have been around for about forever. And once again, I'm going to give props to An American Werewolf in London, which showcases, as I mentioned before, groundbreaking transformation practical effects. And there you have it. That is the wrap up to this video and to the Horror Subgenre 101 series. We talked about the history of the monster creature subgenre. We talked about characteristics, and we talked about some examples. And we've done that for all the other horror subgenres. So I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you enjoyed this series. If you have watched it all, if you had not had a chance to watch it all, again, check it out. It is on my channel. And what is your favorite monster and creature horror? If you have one, let me know in the comments below. And sadly, class is dismissed, everybody. But I will see you next time. Bye.